We're here with David Hummels, and economics professor in the Mitch Daniels School of Business. And his Substack that he co-writes with Jay Ackridge is Finding Equilibrium. And I think there's no more important two words in the world of college athletics these days. And we're discussing a three-part series that David and his co-author Becca Caliendo put together. And Becca's an interesting deal because I want to get to roster limits. And of course, Becca was a track athlete at Purdue and can experience that, but also the effect that this can have on the average athlete in the way that this spending is trending and what this means. Because you have a whole section really on the new landscape of college sports in part 3, if I remember right, in terms of roster limits. And we've talked a lot about how football has gone from 85 to 105. Volleyball has moved up, and that impact on college sports and college athletics and the athlete's experience is potentially going to be pretty strong.
Yeah, so Becca Caliendo's did a lot of the initial data work on this. She was my undergraduate research assistant last year. She finished up her undergraduate degree here at Purdue. She wasn't able to complete her eligibility she was a hammer thrower for the track team. Wasn't able to complete her eligibility because Purdue had to retrench on some financing, needed to cut its rosters to get within the limits, had to make some kind of hard choices. And so she finished her undergraduate degree. She found out very late in the game in the spring, last spring, that she wasn't going to be able to compete, but she'd already applied for and been admitted into a master's program here. And so she's finishing that up this year. She'll go on to Northwestern Law School next year. So in some ways, I think Becca is exactly what we want from college athletics. She was attracted to come to Purdue both because of academic excellence and because she could compete, on a Division I, track team. She graduated with a 3.99 GPA. She was our senior of the year in economics. Tremendous research assistant. So, but I think she is in a lot of ways a great example of what you want to happen in athletics, but which is going to happen less and less in athletics. And the reason in part is these roster limits. So we did this analysis where we went through and said, okay, so it was a sort of change where in Division I, it used to be you were limited in the number of scholarships you could offer and have unlimited rosters. Have as many kids participating as you want. And that changed to sort of say you can have the rosters are strictly limited, and you can offer as many scholarships as you want to anybody who's on a roster, subject to that counts under the revenue sharing number. Any new scholarships count under that revenue sharing number. So what's that mean? If you actually go through, you can use these data from Equity in Athletics, which is the group that really sort of tracks the Title IX compliance stuff. And you can look at the size of rosters that universities had in different sports prior to the roster limits. You kind of go through and say how many students are going to have to get cut. It's about a quarter, like 25% of Division I athletes will lose their ability to participate in intercollegiate athletics because of the roster limits. Really big effects in track and field, in football, in baseball, really kind of the bulk of it. I think women's soccer is also a good one. So I think there are a lot of students who won't have that opportunity. Now, just very quickly on that, you could look at that as a just outcome in the following sense. You could say, well, look, the way this has been operated prior to revenue sharing was the football team made a lot of money. The basketball teams made a good chunk of money. We used that revenue to run the rest of the athletics department. So there was a subsidy flowing from the football team, effectively their revenue generation, to every other part of the athletics department. And so in some ways, these new rules are a rebalancing that sort of says we're going to limit the size of those subsidies, but it does mean that there are, subsidies running from football to other sports.
Right.
So you might say, well, that's fair. And it might be, but it also means that a very large number of student athletes won't be able to compete any longer.
It gets back down to mission of the university and what this is supposed to be all about. And we're going through an existential discussion on that, really, aren't we? I mean, it really comes down to how big of we're talking about things like football creating its own, power league of 32 or 64 teams and separating itself really from not only the NCAA, but its own, and it's already kind of done that, as we well know. Is that a simple way to put this? Is looking ahead that those two sports are football primarily, and then men's basketball certainly is part of that. That's the world that you may see in 10 years. You buy that theory just based on trending of where all this is going.
Yeah. So I think the questions that universities have got to address are, okay, there's this sort of extraordinary revenue generating opportunity out there, mostly attached to football and somewhat to men's basketball.
Yeah.
Do you want to essentially treat those as completely a different beast than every other part of the athletics department, right? So I think the reason we haven't already gone down that path is that in the major conferences, I think pretty much most of the major conferences, you have to compete in a minimum number of sports in order to be a conference member, right? So I don't know what the number is in
18. I think it is in the Big Ten. I believe it still is. And Purdue is at the minimum currently.
Yeah, and so I think if you didn't have that rule, it would become very, very tempting for athletics departments and university presidents to say, you know what, we're gonna quit spending the 70% of our budget that goes to those non-revenue sports. We're going to quit spending the money on that, right? And one of the things that's sort of interesting, I alluded to this idea that it's great having student athletes here. It's great for the student athletes themselves, right? So very good evidence showing that participating in intercollegiate athletics increases retention, graduation, starting salaries after graduation. But there are actually very similar effects for athletes who participate in intramural sports.
Yeah, interesting.
So you don't have to travel all over the country and spend massive amounts of money to get those benefits for the student athletes themselves. You could have them be on the club lacrosse team, and statistically, you see very similar effects.
Yeah, interesting because. Having a daughter that played club soccer, that it was the old-fashioned way. They had to do the vans and do the travel themselves, and it was a great experience. And yet,
so she learned. She had a good time, camaraderie. She got to compete and train and all that good stuff. Yeah.
But there weren't 70,000 people watching her. So there were 7. and that may be Amy and I were 2 of them. All right. You want to look at that, and I thought was something also interested on your view towards NIL. And of course, that's the 3 letters that everybody talks about. And of course, rev share as well. But then that is also a benefit for a few. It's not necessarily benefiting all student athletes, or certainly even in football and men's basketball, it can be very uneven. Talk about that research and give us a highlight of what is in your study on that.
Yeah, so I think the starting point is you kind of want to keep separate these 2 piles of money. There's the revenue sharing, which can go up to $20 million. Now that number is going to grow, right? Because it's tied to the total amount of revenue that the Power 4 conferences earn. And so if the value of TV contracts and so on keep going, ticket sales and so on keep going up, that number is going to keep rising, right? So that's one chunk of money. And then there's the sort of outside money coming from folks, giving money through the NIL program. So I think the interesting challenges around NIL are, you can start from a position that says it's unfair to deny athletes sort of fair compensation for the use of their name, their image, their likeness in generating revenue. And I think the sort of the kind of most obvious parts of this are things like, you're using their names and faces on EA Sports, video games. But then also, you couldn't go, do a commercial or whatever. I think for a small number of athletes, there is real commercial value to a for-profit business for hiring those athletes as spokespersons, right? So Caitlin Clark, right? Enormous phenomenon, not just in sports, but culturally in the U.S. And if State Farm wants to pay her millions of dollars to do ads, terrific. I think that's great. Arch Manning, couple of famous uncles, great name recognition, may or may not be a great quarterback and may or may not make it in the pros, but you can sort of see why Warby Parker might want to have him flogging their glasses. Okay, yeah. So that's cool. I think that the new rules as of a month ago are that NIL deals are supposed to represent market value to for-profit businesses, not pay for play given by alumni and donors to the university, right? And so there's this College Sports Commission, which has this test that's supposed to evaluate whether or not these contracts represent fair market value, whether they are an exchange of money for an immediate business service, not some kind of nebulous later down the road, we're going to ask you to do something. You've got to sort of say, I'm going to do this thing that generates value for a for-profit business. And it's got to be, comparable in value to, other kind of similar contracts for similarly situated athletes in terms of the prominence of their school, their position in the sport, maybe do they have a lot of social media followers and so on, right? And so that College Sports Commission is actually denied a number of contracts and said, these things are not meeting the standard. We're going to see whether or not those contracts actually, whether the College Sports Commission declaring those contracts ineligible or invalid. We'll see whether that holds up in court, right? Yeah. And I think that's a real interesting question, whether this entire aspect of the House settlement ruling that sort of set this new set of landscapes, whether that's actually going to survive its first court challenge. So we don't know. But right now, they're supposed to be meeting a market test. I want to come back to the revenue sharing here in just a second. But I think a really interesting question to think about is the following. So as of the date I pulled the data, it's been about 4 weeks ago now, the College Sports Commission had approved something like $127 million in NIL contracts, right? If you compare that to the value of NIL or not NIL contracts, but just sort of media endorsements in, let's say, the NFL, right? Yeah. They're starting to get almost as large as those NFL endorsement deal values, right? And so, so an interesting question in terms of evaluating the market value of these NIL contracts. Can you really? So we've got, what is it? Let's say 100 football players times 250 schools competing in Division I. So you've got, what is that, 25,000, if I did the math right there, football players compared to what you have in the NFL, roughly 100-person rosters times 30 teams. So it's like 10 times as many college athletes, right? Yeah. None of them have got Patrick Mahomes visibility. None of them are going to get married to Taylor Swift. So they don't have the same visibility. And the question is, does it really make sense that the market value for a third-string wide receiver playing for Tulane is comparable to what professional football players can make? And I'm kind of skeptical that they're really applying a true market value test to these NIL deals, because I just don't think having a typical college athlete endorse your product is that valuable. And like, to give a local example of it, if you watch Purdue basketball on TV, you'll see an advertisement for, I think it's like Freddy's Frozen Custard, where three of the guys, will go on and talk. And here's my favorite frozen custard. It looks like it was filmed on somebody's iPhone, and the audio is kind of a muddy mess. And I can't imagine that paid those guys very much money to do that. But that's the kind of, for the typical athlete, that's the kind of scale of these things that I think probably makes market sense. And I don't know how you get from there to Ohio State generating $35 million in NIL deals. Like how are Ohio State's athletes really generating $35 million in market value for a for-profit commercial enterprise? So I kind of call BS on that, but we'll see how that whole thing shakes out.
And is it as simple, and there's nothing simple about this, there's, a federal commission getting together here in the next week, which will include the president and some other folks that are in the college, and some that aren't, Tiger Woods, that aren't in the college football world or college sports world. Is it as simple as having guardrails and collective bargaining or whatever it is, antitrust, something that brings that level, or is this going to be? Are we looking at ongoing court battles from now to the end of time? I mean, that seems to be the other side of this. If you don't get these things figured out, you're going to have that, and you're going to have, for lack of a better term, chaos in college sports.
Yeah, so I think the heart of the problem, you had a guest on last week who I think you guys had a great conversation about what it is that sports leagues try to do when they put salary caps in place or they select talent via a draft. They're engaged in overt collusion, right? Yeah. And in any other context, that's illegal. Yeah. And when execs try to engage in that, they find themselves fined and potentially, imprisoned. So the reason that sports have been allowed to collude is because basically, so some combination of congressional acts, decisions by the National Labor Relations Board have given them space to collude explicitly in setting the terms of competition. And the reason that the justification that's always been given is the product is competition itself.
Yeah.
And if you don't collude in some sense to level the playing field, you don't have a competitive product. Okay. So now let's think about what's happened in the college context. The NCAA, for a very large time, collusively set the terms of participation in college sports, and did that, I think, arguably to the detriment of college football players and college basketball players. And so you've had this series of court decisions which said that's no longer legitimate. The real challenge you run into now, and with some of these instances that people have gotten pretty upset about in terms of transfer portal stuff and signing professional athletes and so on, is it takes one judge in one court located in the hometown of whatever team it is to basically say NCAA rules are not valid, conference rules aren't valid. And so at that point, conferences in the NCAA are in a position where they could try to enforce rules that will be applied inconsistently depending on whether you've got a local judge to rule in your favor, right? Or they can just kind of give the whole thing up, right? So you've got this collective action problem that says conferences and the NCAA can't solve this problem by themselves, provided you have local judges who are willing to say, yeah, I want my basketball team to be able to sign a professional player. So that's, I'm pretty skeptical of folks in Washington parachuting in to fix an industry generally. But I think when you've got these massive collective action problems, it becomes more reasonable to try and say, look, if you wanted a way out of this, it's probably going to have to come from Washington.
All right, last question. We appreciate all your time, Dr. David Hummels, joining me. And are you optimistic, looking at the lens from 5 to 10 years down the road, that this does get fixed? Is it too big to fail type thing? This is such, college athletics and its economic impact. We talked about not only in West Lafayette, the economic impact of having college football and college basketball here. Are cooler heads going to prevail? We're going to figure this thing out. It's an unfair question in your last question, but are we going to, David, are we going to get there before this is all said and done, do you think?
Well, so I think you have to start from this. College sports are massively entertaining, right? Yeah. And the fact that the TV networks are willing to pay huge sums of money to put especially football and basketball games on the air suggests there's billions of dollars at stake in providing that opportunity to people. And it's not just college sports. I mean, you can see this with the escalating value of TV contracts being paid to the NFL. Broadcast networks have a hard time attracting eyeballs. College sports seems to be a really important way to make that happen. So the money is going to keep flowing. Right. I think that's the first piece. The second piece is people really care about their team doing well. I think that emphasis can be misplaced. I think people don't understand always what they're asking for when they ask their team to throw money at the problem. But it wouldn't surprise me to see in the not too distant future where a kind of situation where there's sort of football and basketball over here to one side and everything else over here. To just kind of recognize the reality is people really, really want to watch the Power Four conferences compete. And as long as that's the case, there's a financial incentive to get that right. It just may mean a wildly different organization of athletics departments. I am hopeful in all of that universities keep front and center. Who are we as institutions? Yeah. And what is it that we are here for? And well, I don't know if your listeners will agree with this or not. To my way of thinking, a winning football team is not why Purdue University exists. Yeah. We exist for the purpose of discovery, of solving the world's biggest problems, of educating 18 to 22-year-olds so that they can be productive members of society. That's what our mission is. And I'm proud to say that that Purdue has kept its eyes on the ball on that pretty squarely throughout this kind of tumultuous period. I hope that continues to be the case. And I wish other universities would take a lesson from how we've done it.
Well, that's blasphemy what you just said, but you're no, I couldn't agree more. And I think you're right. I think Purdue has positioned itself well to be that. Can they stay that way in this world? It will be fascinating to watch out. I probably told David offline, we're not going to bug it. I could have this David on every week to talk about these issues. We got to about half of them. But we will get to more down the road, maybe once a semester or once a year. We so appreciate your time and we appreciate your insight into this. And make sure if you really want to know what's going on in a fascinating study on Jay Ackridge and David Hummel's Substack, Finding Equilibrium. They deal with it also, not weightier topics probably than even college sports too, in terms of where higher ed is moving. It's an excellent, well-written, easy for even people like me to understand Substack. Make sure you check that out. They'll let you subscribe for absolutely nothing. So that's a pretty good deal. David, thanks again so much. Such a great discussion, and we appreciate it so much.
My pleasure, Alan. Great talking with you.
We want to thank our sponsors, XXX on the Hill, but on the level of Purdue tradition since 1929. Of course, State Farm agent Trent Johnson at trentismyagent.com. And most of all, we want to thank you for taking the time to watch Gold and Black Live. This will be our last show for about a month as our season is winding down. We will do one prior to Purdue's spring football game, though it's not actually going to be that, but there's kind of spring scrimmage on April the 11th. I think we'll have a show on April the 10th. We'll bring in some football talk, obviously talk also some postseason basketball and look ahead to that as well. So thanks again to the good folks at WLFI, TJ, Chris Collar, Steve Clark, and for making this happen this year. We really appreciate them very, very much. Grateful to have another year. I think it's we keep losing count, but I think we're 17 years into this, 16 or 17. Who's counting? We've had a lot of fun doing it over the years, and we're thankful for the folks for helping make that happen. So again, have a great rest of your Friday, and if you're watching this on replay, enjoy it. Enjoy your weekend, and we will see you down the road on Golden Black Live.